Well, good afternoon. Got it. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jan Ruzicka, and I am based in the Department of International Politics at Aberystwyth. I'm going to be chairing this roundtable on world order after Russia's aggression in Ukraine. It is my great pleasure to welcome the two chief speakers, Benoit Pelopidas, based at SciencePo in Paris. Benoit is leading a major multi-year project on nuclear weapons, but is also, in my view, one of the most insightful people writing about world and its future and luck, which is what he's really famous for. We've had many a debate about world order, so I'm sure he will have very insightful things to say. Ondrej Ditrych is director of the Institute of International Relations in Prague, I think, very nicely spanning the world of academia and applied research. I think he's under a bit of a pressure by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to always be a little bit more policy relevant, but is an academic of a very fine character and always has very, very interesting things and insightful things to say. I know he's spoken about Ukraine in other fora in the Czech Republic and abroad. And so he will be the other person giving us opening remarks. If I would propose that Ondrej and Benoit speak for about 12-15 minutes with their opening remarks, and then we will throw it open for debate for everybody involved. I think that might just be the best format given the lineup and the virtual room we have. Benoit, would you be so kind to get us going?
Sure, thank you, Jan.
Thank you so much.
So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Benoit, and it's my great pleasure to be with you this afternoon. I want to start by thanking the organizers, so my old friend Jan, but also Oscar and my fellow panelists and the audience, wherever it is. I will look at the topic of today from a very particular angle, which is the angle I've studied with the nuclear knowledges team, which is the issue of nuclear vulnerabilities and how they feature in world ordering. So in order to do that, I'd like to start sharing a screen, which will require at least 10 seconds of your patience if it works, and much longer if it doesn't. Let's do this. So you should see my screen, but it's not yet in the right format. Now you should see the slides and nothing else. Is that correct?
Okay. That is correct, Benoit. Yeah.
Very good. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about nuclear vulnerabilities as defining features of world order and what that means for world order after the current war. So to do so, and to give you a little bit of a preview of what I'll say in the next 10 minutes or so, I'll make essentially three tentative claims. First one is that this order will depend on the impact of the war on actionable arguments about nuclear vulnerabilities. And the problem is that the discourse we already hear about two of them, and those two vulnerabilities I have in mind are vulnerability one, the possibility of the spread of nuclear weapons or further spread of nuclear weapons, and vulnerability two being the possible use of nuclear weapons, deliberate or unwanted. The discourse about those two vulnerabilities is already disconnected from available evidence. And the good news is scholarship can help us shed light on this disconnect and how it may play out politically. And the third point I'll make is that if I'm correct on the first 2 points, that opens up thinking space on how to relate to other vulnerabilities that we need to factor in a time that Ken has called the Great Reckoning. And just by that label, you have a sense of which vulnerabilities I'm thinking about. So those will be the three arguments along the argument that if Ukraine had kept nuclear weapons, it would not have been invaded. This is an argument that is demonstrably false. If you're interested in me, showing you why it's false, I'm happy to do that. I will just not do it in that presentation. So that's kind of a first worry. A first element of the existing discourse. The second element of the existing discourse is a divide and an inconsistency about the possibility of nuclear weapons use. There is a camp that says we're really worried about that possibility and we should give this priority over other considerations. And there is another camp that says, oh, of course, we will never tell you that it is impossible that nuclear weapons will be used, but we will give advice and act as if it actually were impossible. And so I'll try to address those two elements of the existing discourse as unsatisfactory in their treatment of vulnerabilities. So the proliferation discourse is unsatisfactory because it essentially assumes drivers and desires that cannot be confirmed by what we know of the existing history. So desire for nuclear weapons is far from universal. Zoom is doing something. So desire for nuclear weapons is far from universal. And I've shown that renunciation is more frequent than maintained proliferation across levels and across state types. If you look at all states, you can show that at least 143 states have never had any nuclear weapons activities whatsoever, which is quite at odds with the idea that there is an inherent desirability for those weapons. If you look at states with nuclear weapons activities, 30 out of 40 have given up those activities. And finally, among host states, 15 states have ceased hosting and did not acquire nuclear weapons after that. So that's a kind of a first error in the existing discourse and concern about proliferation regarding the desire for those weapons. The second element that needs to be factored in is that not only is there not an inherent desire, we need to keep in mind that among the existing nuclear weapons possessors, none, and I repeat, none, has reached that status without the help of at least one permanent member of the Security Council. And that's a little graph that you can find in the book about who has helped whom, according to the knowledge we have so far, which may be incomplete. Similarly, no P5 member has a perfect non-proliferation track record. So the second element is that not only are nuclear weapons non-inherently desirable, but their spread has been facilitated by nuclear weapons possessors spreading a discourse of desirability as well as spreading selectively technology. So we need to keep that in mind when we think about, the future of proliferation after this war. Now, the second dimension of nuclear weapons-related vulnerabilities, which is arguably the dimension why we all care about that topic, which is that those weapons can go off. I'm just going to make a very trivial statement, which is that we know, and it shouldn't be debated, that nuclear explosions, either deliberate or accidental, remain possible. And we need to think and act in full awareness of that. And that was true even before the explicit nuclear threats made by President Putin. That was true even before we discovered the June 2020 military document in which the Russian military explains the conditions under which it could possibly use tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine in a conventional war, which are very concerning developments. But beyond that, we need to keep in mind the fundamental reasons why nuclear explosions remain possible. They remain possible because the pursuit of credibility of nuclear deterrence requires preparing for using those weapons and communicating the willingness to use them. And doctrines are pretty clear on that front. NATO, as well as most nuclear weapon states, do not have a no first use policy, except China and India, but arguably India is moving away from it, and we could talk about China. And they haven't all signed the protocols of the nuclear weapon free zone treaties that would have committed them to not targeting the states in those zones. Another reason why nuclear explosions remain possible is simply that the sizing of the US in Soviet first and then Russian nuclear forces exceeds the requirement of deterrence. And scholars other than me have long shown that the motifs for the force sizing is beyond deterrence only. In key instances, and this goes back to what Jan was kindly saying when he introduced me, I have shown that in particular instances in the history of the nuclear age, we have avoided unwanted nuclear explosions out of luck. This is important because this means that control alone could not have placed us in a world without unwanted nuclear explosions after 75 years with nuclear weapons. Let's keep that in mind. The final piece of evidence that I would like to provide for the claim that nuclear weapons remain possible, nuclear explosions remain possible, is that war games and crisis simulations, including with recent policymaking elites from the Obama administration, have frequently led to the use of nuclear weapons. But as I suggested, we're not operating, or at least the existing debate is not operating in full awareness of that reality. And I would want to put forward a concept, which is epistemic vulnerability, to account for this gap between available evidence and acceptable knowledge. Epistemic vulnerability is precisely the name for the temptation to overlook the gap between available evidence and existing knowledge. If we give in to that temptation, we fall for overconfidence. Let me tell you briefly how this applies to the two vulnerabilities we've discussed, proliferation and possibility of use. On proliferation, it's quite straightforward. Official discourse in the press and in think tanks essentially perpetuate the discourse of desirability of nuclear weapons in nuclear weapon states and their allies. Happy to give you more detailed evidence, and feel free to look at the book if you're so interested. When it comes to use, I would insist on three reasons why it's hard for us to accept the continued possibility of use of nuclear weapons. The first reason is exteriority. Since 1980, nuclear weapons tests are no longer conducted in the atmosphere, and therefore they are further away from the realm of direct experience for us, and therefore our imagination essentially shrinks about them. The second reason is that we rely on experts, and in particular official experts, to give us a complete picture of nuclear vulnerabilities and of the possibilities of nuclear weapons explosions. Problem is, the experts we rely on are in a social and political position in which they simply cannot do that. Why? Essentially for two reasons. One is because in nuclear weapon states, the discourse of deterrence is crafted as a discourse of protection, and therefore bringing us back to vulnerability would jeopardize that official discourse. And second, as outlined by a French strategist, the late General Lucien Poirier. Poirier said, you know, making your skepticism about the efficacy of nuclear deterrence public is playing in the adversary's hand. So that's a reminder that the discourse of official experts is not just a description of the world as it is, it's also a communicative practice that is aimed at convincing several audiences, including a potential adversary, that the state policy is actually effective and works. So literally, if official experts knew about nuclear vulnerabilities, limits of safety, limits of security, they could not publicly say those limitations for the reasons I've just outlined. Again, I'm happy to give you empirical evidence of those claims. I just don't have much time to do so now. Don't hesitate to ask. The third reason why epistemic vulnerability is a problem is that it is challenging for us to believe in what we know about this possibility. And when I say us, what's interesting is that us extends to policymaking elites. And I say that out of a 3 years cycle of interviews with policymaking and military elites, as well as disarmament activists, most of whom confessed how challenging it is to accept what you know, which is the fact that nuclear weapons can be used deliberately or not. And the point I want to make here is that during the Cold War, we had a particular help, which was visual popular culture, that put us viewers in a space in which it was believable that nuclear weapons could explode. The post-Cold War visual popular culture no longer helps us believe in that possibility, and it actually makes this belief more difficult for reasons that I've documented in an article. The reason why I insist on this is because visual popular culture has played a key role, including on policymaking elites, such as former US President Ronald Reagan or Ambassador Alexander Kment. So with this, I'm reaching my concluding slide in simply restating what I told you, which is that I think world order or the nuclear dimension of it after the war will depend on the impact of the war on the actionable arguments about nuclear vulnerabilities, the desirability, utility, and controllability of nuclear weapons, whether or not those weapons are used in the war. And it will depend on the impact on the war on the attitudes of nuclear weapon states in spreading technology and its desirability. So it's going to be crucial to see whether, if the war ends without the use of nuclear weapons, we immediately rush to claim that nuclear deterrence caused the absence of nuclear use, or whether we open an intellectual space to actually assess the case and accept the possibility that nuclear deterrence may use, or let me phrase it differently, or whether we open an intellectual space to assess whether nuclear deterrence allowed for the absence of use, was an obstacle to the absence of use, or was irrelevant to the absence of use, because it may be one of the three. We shouldn't rush to treat absence of use as meaning success of nuclear deterrence. That's going to be a crucial element. And my final point is that we should, since we're talking about vulnerabilities, we should start thinking about non-nuclear vulnerabilities that are also of an existential kind and start seriously connecting them. That means we should start thinking about the impact of the remilitarization of global politics that Nick Ritchie talked about in his presentation to you a few days ago, the impact of this remilitarization on climate change, but also on other planetary boundaries. That would be a way, I think, to address vulnerabilities beyond the nuclear ones. And even if we want to go beyond the nuclear weapons ones, that should allow us to think that nuclear power plants are weapons in the hands of the enemy, which we knew in the 80s, tend to have forgotten in the war in Ukraine as a reminder of. Thank you.
That's grand, Benoit. Thank you so much. I'll hand over to Ondrej and then we can discuss. Ondrej.
Thank you, Jan, and good afternoon to everyone. I'm really honored to be part of this panel and to be joining you online from South Bohemia. World order after Ukraine war. I mean, 10 minutes is not an awfully long time to discuss a subject of this magnitude. On the other hand, it may be just about right to allow me, hopefully, to avoid the general confusion that seems to rule the political debate at the moment. But my presentation will be, I guess, less structured and focused than Benoit, and for that I apologize in advance. But I will try to make a few points. First, this war, horrible as it is not a transformative event in global politics. I mean, we look in shock at the human tragedy caused by this war, the war crimes, Russia military commits in Ukraine, the breach by the Kremlin of some of the fundamental norms of international law and society. But the majority of international community is less moved. The war is not a transformative event since it produces neither a change in the balance of power nor a major rupture in the normative order. And in thinking through the long-term impact of the war, as much as, by the way, devising proper response in the short term, which includes allocating limited resources that our governments have, there are few critical or at least important uncertainties. Now, the first is Russia's leadership intentions. And many make authoritative claims on the matter, but I would propose that it tells us more about their politics, proclivity to certain ground or folk theories, cultural representations, or just a penchant for making historical analogies and playing out geopolitical melodramas, like Munich, if I speak from Central Europe. So we have a very limited way of knowing whether it's security or some kind of imperialism or revisionism that moves Russia's policy, whether the objectives are articulated in more moderate or more extensive way. We only know that the means are clearly excessive and extreme. And we don't know to what extent, Kremlin is really responsive in terms of defining its long-term objectives to the external circumstances, to what extent it's going by some kind of plan and it's more static or it's more dynamic. This matters, but we have actually a quite limited way of knowing. I mean, personally, I'd go for more moderate combination of security and revisionism, but also dynamically evolving and responding to circumstances. But there is a high degree of uncertainty in that assessment of mine. Another key uncertainty is the long-term effect of this war and all that comes with it on Russia. The sanctions that the European Union and others imposed, all 6 packages, have clearly not had a tangible effect in the short term in terms of deterrence or compellence. But they still can have effect in the long term, even when they are not maintained in entirety. For example, due to suspension of some of the sanctions as part of the future peace deal. And that, Russian people are just, hard and resilient and can bear a lot of hardship, maybe just one of those stereotypical cultural representations that actually likely made Putin to believe that Ukraine's special operation would be over in a couple of days. The war likely that it will hurt the material basis for Russia standing over a longer period of time. And this can mean a number of things, better or worse. The third uncertainty is what this war will do to the rest of the continent. It seems to me that Putin believes that he has time on his side, which, by the way, I think it makes it very hard to deal with him. I think it's difficult to have strategic interactions with someone who believes that time is on their side. But what he means is intermediate time, in which the collective West will not have the will to sustain the support for Ukraine and will be politically weakened by the current kind of multi-layered crisis that's bound to produce more polarization and populist governments, inward looking and struggling to govern once they are in power. And their standing too may diminish, or the collective West standing may diminish elsewhere as the war produces negative externalities that can be more readily blamed for historical, cultural reasons on Washington, London, or Paris rather than Moscow. And the question is, can Putin be actually right here? The final uncertainty to me is China. And it seems to me that this is a very inconvenient war for China due to timing. The decision to support Russia, however, indirectly in this war seems to be internally controversial. However, President Xi seems to have concluded that he continues to need to rely on Russia in pursuing China's global power status and ambitions, which may eventually mean the need to break from the first island chain, with repercussions for Taiwan, of course. And that also the reputation costs of that indirect support, in particular as one can maintain some ambiguity here, will be limited. But should the war linger and produce more negative externalities in the global south, like the food crisis, this calculus can possibly change. So to conclude these, less than structured remarks, perhaps the war, I believe, is not a transformative event, but a piece in the chain of events that together lead to a more profound structural transformation, global order toward fragmentation and bipolarity, Russia's dreams of multipolarity notwithstanding. It seems to me, reading what the Russian sophists, the public intellectuals have to say, that Russia's political class to be in some sort of denial about this. But it seems to me that in the long term, I think it's very plausible to expect major dependencies and a highly asymmetric relationship to Beijing as a result. Now, this transformation, I think, is already underway, and it can actually be seen as one of the structural causes of the war in Ukraine, since it means reduced capacity to manage tensions in regional security systems. So it's not a transformative event globally, but the crucial importance of the war is precisely at the level of this regional security system. And I think here, in principle, it is possible that some new security order that will be seen as legitimate by all parties and therefore will be reasonably stable will emerge on the ruins of the current one, institutionalized through OSCE. It's not going to be based on friendship, it never was, but a degree of trust developed over time may be seen as an asset to all, to manage the tense relations in a highly militarized environment and with the nuclear threat looming in the background. But whether such order will emerge is uncertain. It will depend on many variables, only some of which I've mentioned. The US role in Europe, United States role in Europe, determined in part by internal politics, is one I didn't. The Kremlin will likely continue to act in an opportunistic fashion for as long and as much as its relative capacities allow it, and as long as the current leadership is in place. So thank you. That's all my initial round of remarks, and I'll be happy to develop them based on your questions. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Ondrej. I think we've got about 25-30 minutes, so why don't I go straight and open it up to questions from the people on in the audience. If there are any questions, please indicate by raising your hand, and I'll try to moderate this as much as I can. If there are no questions, I've got a page full of them, so I can get us going, but I don't want to abuse my position here. Are there no takers then? Can. You're on mute, Ken.
Okay.
Good.
This is a question for both of you, but it arises, I suppose, out of Ondrej's proposition that the war is not a transformative event. I mean, you've sort of implied we can't say that because we don't know what the outcome is. But it seems to me that there are some outcomes that would be transformative. And I'd like you to know what you think the likelihood of one of the outcomes would be, and whether you would agree with me and those like me who would argue that it would be a transformative event. And that would be if there was something that we could call a Russian victory. The ultimate, I suppose, in terms of what we could call a Russian victory would be the as Putin would like, the elimination of Ukraine, the incorporation of the little brother of Ukraine into the Russian state or empire. It seems to me that if that were to be the outcome, then we would be in a significantly different world order. And I know there are problems about analogies, but it would be sort of back to a 1914 world, in the sense of it's an age of conquest. It would be an age whereby the idea that states don't use military force to change international boundaries, the sort of international norms that have developed in the past century, this would now be old-fashioned. And so here we would have Russia, one of the major powers in the world, incorporating Ukraine, and then where next? Presumably, if Ondrej is right and Putin thinks he's got a long trajectory ahead, it could include Moldova, it could include bits maybe of the new NATO up in the north. And we could see, so on one hand, they would be doing that, and then the Chinese continuing with their what might be called neo-colonialism or old-fashioned imperialism in trying to scoop up an empire like the British did back in the period before that. So it seems to me that there is, the war has not been so what I would say is that the war has not been transformative yet, but it does have the potential to be very transformative.
Ondrej, would you like to react, and Benoit as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, thanks for the point. I basically agree. I only think that the outcome that you outline is not very likely because of the limited capacities by Russia to conquer the whole of Ukraine and then continue to roll on. Though of course we cannot be sure about it. But at the same time, I would kind of use your intervention to underscore the point that I probably didn't make very clearly, and that is not to kind of underplay the impact that the war has. I mean, there are these waves already, you know, and I mean, it does contribute to weakening of a certain normative order as much as the annexation of Crimea had done in 2014. It's a manifestation of that weakening, and it further contributes to this weakening and fragmentation, and the effects are felt around the world. And you know, the problem is, I guess, that when it comes to high energy prices, for example, not just in Europe, but in the global south, it's not overwhelmingly Mr. Putin and his war that are blamed for that. But I take your point absolutely. I mean, if that scenario that you outlined came to be reality, then the effect could indeed be really much more transformative.
Benoit, would you like to come in on this?
Sure. Thanks,
Please.
Ken, for the question. So that brought like four, it's an odd number, but four ideas to me in response to this. One is like Ondrej, I really agree with the two-part statement, which is we don't know yet whether it's a transformative event, but it has the potential of becoming one. And then the question is like, what would need to happen in order for that event to become transformative? And so the second point I want to make is about the role of historical analogies, and tell you a bit of a story that people on this call may not know because it happened in France, but I think it's very revealing and it points to one, I think, possible event that would make this war a transformative event. And of course, we all have to rely on analogies because, we know the past better than the future. So this is where we start. And interestingly, there was a very high-profile debate in the French newspapers between a former advisor of President Sarkozy, Henri Guénaud, who was very worried about escalation and used the 1914 analogy explicitly in like sleepwalkers kind of explanation about the way to World War I. And so that was kind of one camp. And so you had one camp relying behind this gentleman, Henri Guénaud. And then you had another expert whom I'll not name, but you can guess who that is, who essentially said, oh, playing that game is being on the side of Munich. And so essentially allowing for any fear of the Russian aggressor is being favorable to Munich. But to me, what that tells us, and that kind of brings us back to what I was saying, is that the two analogies are pre-nuclear ones. And so that allowed the entire debate to overlook the fact that there is one thing that could make the war a transformative event, which is the use of tactical nuclear weapons by the Russian Federation, which, as I suggested, is clearly outlined as a possibility in the June 2020 military document signed by Vladimir Putin. And what makes it even scarier is that even the moderate voices in the US, they say, oh, if that happens, we would not respond with nuclear weapons. We would just respond with conventional strikes on Russian territory. And so essentially that, just the crossing the nuclear threshold and opening that possibility would make it a transformative event. There are other, I think, features that could make this a transformative event, is that if energy supply and water supply to the West gets fundamentally challenged if the war, lasts long enough for that to happen. And essentially, my point here is that what will decide whether or not it's a transformative event is whether the players in the world order take a particular lesson from this or not, whether they think, okay, the priority existential threat is the next Mr. Putin. Therefore, we need to prepare for land invasion and for an adversary that can only be deterred by nuclear weapons, or whether they think, no, Putin is unique. Therefore, the existential threat that we're facing is of a different kind. So I think the key answer to your question depends on the lessons that are learned by the key players from the way the war goes and the way it may end. One last point, which is the fourth one that I promised, is more about what the discussions so far since the beginning of the war have revealed. One thing that I found interesting is that in democratic nuclear weapon states, I'm mostly thinking about France and the UK, but also to a lesser extent in the US, reliance on nuclear weapons for security is based on the sense that essentially the burden of responsibility falls on the shoulder of the head of state, and we can rely on responsible heads of state. In France and in other places, when it became serious that Russia could use nuclear weapons, it was really interesting to me how fast several commentators, including high-level military personnel, said, oh, no, don't worry. Even if the head of state gives that order, someone will disobey. So that means that essentially the bet to rely on nuclear weapons for security for the long term, in their mind, doesn't rely on one person being right all the time, but it relies on the robustness of the chain of command, which I've called in my book fortuitous disobedience. So they essentially believe that people will disobey whenever it is necessary, but only then, even if they are trained never to disobey. And I thought that came out much clearer. So I wrote it in the book and thought everyone was going to treat me like a crazy person because my only example was General Kaler in the face of the US Congress. But with that, we have had multiple military people making exactly similar claims. So I thought that was something that was interesting.
Great, thanks so much, Benoit. More questions from the floor? If there are no questions I would like to ask then, I've got one question for each of you. Benoit, you concluded that there is a range of, well, I think you implied that there is a range of options on how this turns out. Do you think that any of the options would be a novel one? In other words, I know you saw the panel we had at York on Thursday, and the consensus by the panelists, one of which was Nick Wheeler, the others were Laura Considine and Nick Ritchie, was that there is essentially not that much new under the sun here in terms of nuclear stuff. I am slightly skeptical of that position, but of course I was just a chairperson there. I wonder whether you share that view with the view that the range of options is essentially known to us, or whether you foresee that there would be a novel option emerging out of this war, something that in his remarks on Thursday Ken implied, which you would have probably heard as well. So that's for Benoit. The other is for Ondrej. There's a really interesting point when you spoke about the Russians and the belief that the time is on their side. It seems to me that that's a common belief by revisionist states. They always think time is on their side because, of course, the old order is falling apart, and therefore time is inevitably on their side because they are the future, the revisionists. And I wonder whether that is a cardinal mistake of all revisionist states, actually, and what the implication of this belief for the wider order into the future is. Yeah, and now having asked the question, may I invite you to answer to my questions, which sounds very pompous.
So I realized my previous answer was way too long, so this one will be very brief. And it will essentially consist in saying that as long as we remain in a control paradigm, of course, nothing new could possibly happen. But, having researched luck, the role of luck, unplanned and unforeseen past the nuclear disaster, I think we need to allow for the possibility of novelty, even if we cannot think about its shape now.
That's great. Ondrej.
It's a great question, and I'm afraid I don't have a ready-made answer for that. Well, I think possibly many, if not all, revisionist states, have this idea that the rest of the world is somehow in a state of decadence, or at least the existing centers, and that's exactly what the Kremlin ideology is. And it may actually be self-defeating to some extent. I mean, it's plausible to think that the Russian leadership did not believe that there would be these sanctions, for example, put in place, and had the collective West been more credible, possibly it could have turned out another way. I guess the answer probably needs to take into account the time frame. In the long run, of course, no revisionist state can be successful, I guess, but at the same time, the international order is changing. So in the short term, the change is certainly possible and has been done in the past by states that challenge the status quo. But it's probably as much as I have to say on this at the moment. But I would be happy, and actually it's stimulating to think about it more.
Well, we will have a chance in Prague next week, hopefully.
Yep.
So I register Nick Wheeler as the next person to raise his hand. Nick, please. Nick from the comfort of his great study in Malvern.
Thank you, Jan, and thank you, Benoit and Ondrej. So I just wanted to come back on what Jan said about that there was nothing, that we'd said that there was nothing kind of new, because I wanted to nuance that slightly, because one of the things that I explored was this question of whether Putin marks in some way with the nuclear threats a break from past Soviet crisis behavior, and indeed past crisis behavior on the part of the superpowers during the Cold War, and whether his approach to nuclear weapons is one that, in a sense, fundamentally challenges the nuclear revolution thesis. And that this idea that nuclear weapons can be manipulated for coercive and blackmail purposes. So I raised that as a question in terms of how far we needed to worry about the risks of nuclear use, and to what extent. So I'd be interested in both of your responses to that, and whether you think in some way there is something different here in the way in which Putin approaches nuclear weapons, not just in this crisis, but more generally in relation to behavior of Russia since going back to 2014 and maybe earlier. So do you think, in a sense, we're dealing with a leader who, perhaps for the first time in the nuclear age, is willing to see these nuclear weapons in a very different way? And I recognize, of course, that the strategic nuclear war planning and the actual operational strategies, of course, have not responded to the nuclear revolution thesis. But I think, the point Campbell Craig and others have made, in crisis situations, are we seeing something, different here? And then that kind of links to my question, which is one I've been thinking about since the beginning of the war, and which I'd be interested in everybody's thoughts on the call. How far is this a riskier crisis than any other that we've experienced since the beginning of the nuclear age? Where does it sit in the lexicon of risk? And what does that mean in terms of the possibilities for the stability, instability paradox? Because there's a lot of people who are wanting to argue that there's far greater room for maneuver in terms of NATO's military intervention in this war to push the Russians out and to reverse the territorial situation, because they think that the risks of escalation are very low. But of course, the nuclear revolution thesis that Jervis and Brody and so on pioneered is all predicated on the idea that any use of force, even at the very lowest level, that involves a direct confrontation between the forces of two nuclear-armed states, could escalate to the all-out strategic level. So I wondered what your reflections were on that. And I guess a final point, Benoit, about luck is, if by intervening militarily in this crisis directly to ensure what Ken was saying, that Putin doesn't get any kind of reward and is pushed out, if that increases the risk by just say even 1% of nuclear use, given everything you've written about the importance of luck in nuclear crisis situations, should we be much more cautious in approaching that, given that control is an unstable basis? Thank you. That was a lot of kind of points brought together, but hopefully you can pick up on some of those.
Thanks, Nick. Characteristically from the English school background, nicely put. I do apologize to slightly misrepresenting your position. On Thursday, my point was that the behavior that might be imputed to Putin would not be outside the realm of options that are familiar to us. From a rationally calculating Soviet, he's just become a crazy dictator. Anyways, I shall let Ondrej and Benoit to respond. Ozgur, can I ask how much we're tied to the 1745 end frame? Have we got a little bit of room? Because there is at least one more question I see.
If you want, we can go for more 10 minutes.
Oh, excellent. So we've got plenty of time. Afi, I will call on you next, but I would invite Ondrej and then Benoit to respond to Nick's broad remarks. So pick and, in other words, in old diplomatic practice, pick and choose whatever you wish to answer.
Ondrej should go
Or I can
first.
ask my own question.
Yeah, no, Ondrej, you go ahead.
No, I mean, I will not pretend to be the real expert here. So just with that caveat, I mean, if Mr. Putin is different or not, I mean, he probably like us to think that he is different, and his threats are credible because of that, and he has shown repeatedly back in 2014 and now again that he's willing to engage in nuclear messaging to deter external intervention in his wars of choice. Whether this is the riskiest situation since the dawn of the nuclear age, I don't know. I'm not a historian. Many people speak about Caribbean crisis, and I don't know to what extent these are comparable and the risk can be measured in similar ways. But it's undoubtedly a very risky situation. My kind of slightly superficial take on this, and I would be happy to be contested on this that deterrence seems to be working actually, and it's horrifying and sometimes very frustrating way, especially for us in the West who have been used to, I mean, taking casualties and damage in the wars that we waged over time, but not having been constrained in a similar way and doing what many would like to do in face of the horrendous crimes in Ukraine, for example. But it's a very precarious thing. This deterrence, it's not something stable. We are engaged in this kind of tolerance warfare when we test the boundaries constantly, and we got to a state when Western states can support send heavy weapons to Ukraine, and this is not challenged by Russia, even though it's undoubtedly not seen as something highly pleasing. I mean, I don't have a reason to think that Russian government would use nuclear weapons in contradiction to its current doctrine. At the same time, when that doctrine contains reference to existential interest of the Russian state, and we can assume that the leadership of the state is pretty paranoid, and the interpretation of that, and this can mean the use of tactical nukes in Ukraine also is something that is not entirely stable, I think. So I'll stop here.
Right, Benoit.
Okay, thanks, Nick. So 3 reactions. One, I'll kind of do what you did. I'm actually glad you corrected your statement. You actually re-explained your statement from earlier in the week, because when I watched the video, the sound when you spoke was lower, so I couldn't hear what you said. So at least I have a sense of what you said. So that's great. So I'll do the same thing and kind of correct my own statement. Because some people, and that's kind of strange. Some people take the Campbell and Sergey article about MAD as an anti-luck argument and as proving that luck can be replaced by that. But there, and I don't know if they say that, but they shouldn't, because literally what they say is that the leaders that they care about were reluctant to use nuclear weapons. I'm totally fine with that. But that is an anti-luck argument only if you can show that those leaders had complete control over the weapons, in that nothing out of them could use the weapons. And that's demonstrably false. And that's my entire point, which is due to delegation. There were a lot of situations where leaders didn't have complete control over the weapons. In several instances, unwanted nuclear explosions could have happened either independently from control practice, thanks to the failure of control practice, or in spite of the failure of control practice. So just wanted to say that if one take the Campbell and Sergey article as proving that luck doesn't have a role, that's a retrospective illusion of control. And I at least Campbell, I don't think would say that. Then your question about, the nuclear revolution thesis and the issue of risk-taking and how that progresses, I want to essentially say two things. One is, I don't know what the Russian red lines are, and whoever claims to know that should take responsibility for making those claims. What's interesting there is that, and here I rely on a fabulous article that David Holloway published in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist, which is called Read the Fine Print, where he explains that what Putin said in February, in what's written in a 2020 document explaining that you could use tactical nuclear weapons in a conventional war, if the, as Ondrej suggested, if the existence of the Russian state is at stake, the wording is the same. So that was an explicit nuclear threat. And if we take that threat seriously, that puts us into a pretty difficult dilemma, right? Because the closer we get to the position of, if our war aim is to defeat Russia, the closer Russia gets to humiliating defeat, the closer we get to that prospect. So that's the dilemma that we have to negotiate, right? In terms of how to think about this, one element that is interesting is that if we think about the use of tactical nuclear weapons, what we know about them, mostly thanks to Pavel Podvig, is that the warheads and the delivery vehicles are not in the same place yet. So it wouldn't just be one order the way it would be for using strategic weapons. It would apparently be an order to couple the weapons and then a second order to use them. So if you're asking me to give one piece of reassurance, that's the only one that comes to mind. At least we would have one thing to look for to get a sense of how much closer we are to the situation we really want to avoid. I hope that helped, and thanks for the question.
That's great. Thanks so much, Benoit. I think this will need to be the last question. Afi Ashraf from Loughborough University.
Thank you very much. To some degree, my question has been addressed in the last answer, but I would like to just pursue it a little bit for clarity. This idea that tactical nuclear weapons is somewhat a novel issue is something that I need a bit more clarity on, because from a practitioner's point of view, rather than an academic's point of view, I know that NATO had tactical nuclear weapons, and the reason for their development was primarily to transfer from a policy or strategy of tripwire to flexible response. And the scenario that NATO forces worked on was that should there be a conventional force attack in the inner German border, we had accepted that being conventionally weaker, we would fight a retreating conventional battle to the extent that about 72 hours later, we would be forced to use tactical nuclear weapons, not as a deterrence, but as a coercive measure to negotiation before going to strategic nuclear. This was, of course, a hypothesis that's never been fully tested. It was a very high risk hypothesis, but which was probably only slightly lower risk than tripwire. So my point is this: why is the idea that Russia might be considering tactical nuclear weapons as an interim stage to strategic nuclear attack novel? And is that necessarily what the Russians will actually do in reality? Would they just be using the idea of tactical nuclear as a smokescreen? Would they not use their advantage, their considerable advantage in hypersonic delivery of vehicles for a first strike advantage? Anyhow, I'd be very interested in whatever thoughts anybody has on that.
Benoit, would you like to tackle that? And we would then give Ondrej final reflection on whatever he pleases. I think we've got about 2 minutes before we need to vacate for the next panel.
Okay, so I'll be very brief. Thank you, sir. I'll give you a frustrating answer. The first part of the frustrating answer is that the second part of your question requires to know the red lines of the Russian leader, and I don't. So I'm not going to make any pronouncements on this. The one thing that I do care about is that we should not let the tactical / strategic distinction, become a smokescreen. And so we should remember that what we're talking about when we talk about Russian tactical nuclear weapons, their destructive capacity is over 25 times the Hiroshima bomb. Let's keep that in mind to just get a size. And let's not, I wouldn't want to enter into speculation about what happens after. Thank you.
That's great. Ondrej, any final remarks you may choose to have?
I think, well, it's an intriguing thought, but I honestly don't know. I know I agree with Benoit that we would need to know much more to be able to think through this. Well, I think Russia has proven to be pretty reckless in the wars that it waged in the past, using conventional means. And going perhaps back to what I said about this war as being transformative event or not, of course, the use of a tactical nuclear weapon could have this transformative effect, though it might not have any very real battlefield effect. It would be the symbolism, I guess. And I find it also quite reassuring what Benoit said about at least this two-step process. And I will probably stop here because I don't feel I have much more to say from, let's say, more expert-like perspective.
Brilliant. All that remains to be done from my end is to thank the organizers, CESRAN International, for hosting the entire conference and this roundtable, and for the invitation. I would like to thank the people who have joined us. And most of all, I would like to thank Benoit Pelopidas and Ondrej Ditrych for their excellent remarks. There was a lot to get us thinking. There is a lot more to think about, as always, in the study of international politics. The honest answer is we don't know. It will depend, and that's great because it will keep us going. So thank you. Thanks to our audience, and have a lovely rest of Saturday. For those of you in the UK and in Europe, don't fry tomorrow and Monday. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much.
Okay, cheers.